Also have Professor Chesney. Professor Chesney is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at Texas Law and the Director of the Strauss Center for International Security and Law. His scholarship and research has focused on international and national security issues.
Have you been mining?
So I guess I know what my voice sounds like now. That's unfortunate. Professor Chesney is also a co-founder and contributor to the Lawfare blog, which provides legal analysis and commentary. And he co-hosts the award-winning National Security Law podcast with Professor Vladeck, who is also here with us today. So Professor Vladeck is a Texas law professor and holds the Charles Allen Wright Chair in Federal Courts at Texas Law. He specializes in federal courts, constitutional law, national security law, and military justice. Professor Vladeck has argued various cases before the U.S. Supreme Court and the Texas Supreme Court, and he has co-authored leading national security law and counterterrorism law textbooks. He's also CNN's leading Supreme Court analyst. So we're so honored to have these distinguished...
She said ESPN.
We're so honored to have these distinguished professors here to talk with us today about this important ongoing conflict. We'll start with some historical background from Professor Kahn, followed by a panel discussion that'll be led by Professor Chesney, and there will be plenty of time for Q&A as well. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Professor Kahn.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'd like to speak without the microphone so that it actually looks like I'm really lip-syncing whoever is speaking here is going to put into my mouth. I want to show you 3 maps and 2 pictures, just as a sort of 10-minute introduction to the topic. I'm of the view that the most interesting part of these events is in the Q&A, so I got to get out of the way of that. The first map just gives you a sense of scale. There's Ukraine with Texas superimposed on top of it. And aside from noticing that it's roughly the same size, what I really want you to notice is that we've got here in Texas 1, 2, 3, 4, 4.5, maybe 5 straight line borders. 5 straight line borders. You won't find any straight line borders in this part of the world. There are, roughly speaking, only 2 reasons why you're ever going to get, sorry, that was just a little bit of puberty coming back. There are only 2 reasons why you're going to get straight line borders in the world. Example 1 would be us, or Canada, or Australia, where after a pretty devastating occupation and destruction of the indigenous peoples of the world that is found, there is not enough ethnic, religious, nationalist tension between the more or less winning parties to worry about fighting back and forth about territory. And so what do you get, especially as you move progressively westward? Straight line borders. The second case of straight line borders, roughly similar to the first, but just a temporal difference, was brought up by Kenya's ambassador to the UN Security Council, Ambassador Kamani, last week, when he said, when borders are drawn in the metropolitan cities of colonial rulers, as they quickly leave, they're often born without any regard to the existing complexities and patterns of ethnicity, language, religion. And so the first point I want to make is, this is a part of the world where all those complexities are there exponentially large. You have east to west in Ukraine, a religious divide between Catholic Christians in more or less the western part and Orthodox Christians of different persuasions in the eastern part. There used to be a very prominent Jewish population. This was part of the Pale settlement in the Russian Empire, where Jews were required to live, but virtually all of the Jewish population has been destroyed in one way or another, and most recently with 1.5 million in the Holocaust. There is a tremendous linguistic divide between Ukrainian and Russian, not to mention other languages. Ukrainian and Russian are not the same language. There are ethnic divides. And so what I want you to take away from my remarks, if nothing else, is that what you're witnessing in Ukraine today is in very many ways the revenge of the past. You can think of it as a revenge of an imperial past. You can think of it as a revenge of a Soviet past. I don't think that revenge of those pasts is what Vladimir Putin has in mind, but it's certainly those pasts. And he's thinking in a very long-term, long-scale scope. I also want to have you take away that one of the most important principles of international law is at stake in this conflict. And we have to remember that international law is made in a variety of ways, and among the ways it is built and reinforced and also dismantled is by practice. And so what is happening here really matters. And that principle is the principle of Uti Posideus, that the borders you've got are the borders that should remain, that we're not going to re-examine those borders. And Ambassador Kamani's point in bringing up that colonial legacy in the African continent was to say, more or less, we in Africa have chosen to live with those borders, despite their imperfections, in fact, massive imperfections. But better that than, well, what you're seeing. So that's the first slide. Second map.
Region.
You got it? I got it. Hopefully this is what Vladimir Putin is going to feel like in a few weeks. There we go. The second map is a map of the Soviet Union. And what I want you to take away from this map, we often refer to the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation as Russia. And it is not a homogeneously ethnic Russian state. This is a multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, multi-faith place, and it was built precisely to avoid what was a very popular Bolshevik slogan in the Russian Revolution, release from the prison house of nations. There were two slogans. You've got nothing to lose but your chains. That turned out not to be so true. And release from the prison house of nations. And that definitely turned out not to be true. The Soviet Union, if we could dim the lights, please, was a union of Soviet Socialist republics. There were 15 Soviet Socialist republics, one of which is Ukraine. Another one I'll get to in a moment is Moldova, which is just to the west of Ukraine, wedged between Romania and Ukraine. The Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were Soviet Socialist republics. All the stands of Central Asia, those were created. They had borders originally, but they were created as part of this space. But more to the point are these sort of orangey ASSRs, autonomous Soviet Socialist republics. These are all regions that were created by the first Commissar of Nationalities in the early 1920s. His name was Joseph Stalin. And the idea was to create regions for non-Russian ethnic groups and to make sure that their borders would prevent them from ever becoming independent. So if you look at those borders from a Soviet perspective, when the stands were still part of the Soviet Union, the Bashkir Republic, do I get a laser beam with this?
Oh, yeah.
Woo. There's the Bashkir Republic. You can see there's a little strip of Orenburg Oblast, Russian, ethnically Russian territory, 70 kilometers wide. Its sole purpose is to make sure Bashkortostan is an island. Bashkortostan's got lots of natural gas, oil, resources. It's got a very robust Turkic ethnic group, the Bashkirs, Muslim Turkic ethnic group. They'll never become an independent country. Likewise, Chechnya, you might have heard of Chechnya. The conflict in Armenia and Azerbaijan was suppressed in part by force, but also by borders, by dividing up territory and keeping control. That's why we have the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and started restarting in the 1980s, late 1980s. So why do I tell you all about this? These are frozen conflicts. And what you're seeing in Ukraine is in part an unfreezing of conflict. Now, the world draws its attention periodically, and then we get distracted by, small things like COVID and baseball. But the conflict in Ukraine has been going on since before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And what I put to you, you're seeing now, is a reconflagration, a heating up at a moment when Vladimir Putin thinks it's worth doing so. So that's the second map. Here's Ukraine today. And I mentioned Moldova. I mentioned it quite deliberately out of the other 15 Soviet Socialist republics, because I want to point out that there is currently stationed in what's known as the Transnistrian People's Republic. Anybody from the Transnistrian People's Republic? No, because nobody can get a passport out of the Transnistrian People's Republic, and it's only recognized by a handful of states, one of them being Russia, whose 14th Army is stationed there in part as peacekeepers. Peacekeepers. It's a euphemism. The whole reason for that conflict remaining unsettled is to keep a marker there, to keep a wedge there, to try to increase back lost space. So many of you might have heard that Vladimir Putin thinks that the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. He has many reasons for that. He'll be happy to tell you about them if you'll stand about 50 feet away from them. So his modus operandi has been clear from the start. He didn't put the 14th Army there. Boris Yeltsin did, but it's the same MO. The idea is to keep places destabilized, to keep borders confused. And so when the Soviet Union starts to collapse, and its collapse is precipitated by a series of declarations of independence, first from the Baltic states. They had been independent sovereign states recognized on the world stage for some time between the wars, but thanks to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, they were annexed by the Soviet Union in June of 1940. They were the first to reclaim their independence. And one by one, a parade of declarations of sovereignty and declarations of independence emerged from these SSRs. The ASSRs tried it too, more or less as bargaining chip to make deals with Moscow, knowing they could never leave, but hoping to make a better deal for economic, political, educational, cultural, linguistic representation. Moldova declared its independence, and that's what triggered the Transnistrian conflict, to make sure that that state couldn't get too far. Crimea in 2014, after the Maidan revolution, I'll just speak for just 3 or 4 more minutes. After the Maidan revolution and Viktor Yanukovych's flight to Moscow, little green men, in other words, soldiers, but without insignia on their uniforms, any designation to tell you who they are or where they're from, and repeated assurances from the Russian Federation that there was no intention to occupy Crimea. After all, the Black Sea Fleet was perfectly safe in a base at Sevastopol on that peninsula where the lease had been renewed for the next 25 years. So, nothing to worry about. Lo and behold, in dark of night and in a very short time, Crimea is seized, annexed by the the Russian Federation. And a short time later, you have a conflict in Donbass. This is a classic, mostly coal-driven area, and it's the same MO. It's the same MO. An assertion that peoples are being oppressed, their linguistic rights aren't being considered, their ethnic interests aren't being considered, their religious interests aren't being considered. There's a corrupt regime in the capital. And like most lies, there's a kernel of truth to each of those claims. But Udiposi Davis, we prefer not to open up that Pandora's box. And when Ukraine declared its independence, the first thing that Boris Yeltsin did was to say, well, we're not quite sure that Crimea is Ukrainian, and we're not quite sure that Donbass is Ukrainian. Those borders, are contested. We've had flux in and out of different parts of the Soviet Union for 73 years. The next thing that happened was that Ukraine said, well, a third of your nuclear missiles are stationed in Ukraine. And the Black Sea Fleet, we think, at least part of it is Ukrainian. Not to mention various army depots in and around Ukraine, because they were all stationed there to fight World War III against us. So that led to negotiations, ultimately resolved in 1994 with something called the Budapest Memorandum, which said that in exchange for Russian Federation recognition of the sovereignty of Ukraine and the inviolability of its borders, in particular Crimea and the Donbass, the exchange of nuclear weapons can proceed. Nuclear weapons could be taken out of Ukraine as they were taken out of Belarus and out of Kazakhstan, to the great increase in world peace. The atomic clock in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists stood at 17 minutes to midnight in 1991. I checked last night, and we're at 100 seconds to midnight today. That's the clock that tells you when it's all over.
It's the clock that'll tell us.
Yeah. And by the way, there is Chernobyl, which was one of the places that was occupied by one of the Russian armies as they moved south from their exercises in Belarus. So those are the three maps I want to show you. The revenge of the past, frozen conflicts. Ukraine, and here is a kernel of truth again to the lie, Ukraine has been part of the Russian Imperium for 300 years, at least. The word Russia comes from the concept of Kievan Rus. Kiev and Rus. And since at least the start of the Romanov dynasty in 1648, up through the Soviet Union, only the last 30 years has Ukraine been truly separate. Kiev truly separate from Moscow. So now the pictures. I want to give you a sense of the way I think Vladimir Putin views the world. This is a mural that's painted on the side of a building in Moscow. I think that the Stalin wedding cake building off to the right is the foreign ministry, but I'm not quite sure. And what it says is "Pomnit mir spasiony," the saved world remembers. It trips off the tongue a little better in Russian. "Pomnit mir spasiony," the saved world remembers. In other words, we defeated Nazi Germany. We saved the world. World War II in Russia is called the Great Patriotic War, and there is no discounting or minimizing the horrific loss of life that the Soviet Union suffered. Ukraine lost 7 million people in that conflict, and a million more in the famine that followed the year after. The saved world remembers. So it's this mentality. I want to show you one more picture. This was posted on the Twitter site for Novaya Gazeta, which won the Nobel Peace Prize this past year. It's a Russian newspaper, one of the few independent newspapers, and it might not be lasting very long. Echo Moskvy was closed yesterday. But it shows pictures of kids, one of my daughter's age, about 9 or 10 years old. They were out, the caption says, out in front of the Ukrainian embassy, laying flowers, 50, laying flowers at the embassy, and they were arrested. So they are being processed here in the Presnenskaya district police station. The little girl there has a sign that says "No to War," and I show you this picture because if the last picture shows you Vladimir Putin's view on the rest of the world, this picture shows you what you can expect inside Russia. There was a hope that reforms largely catalyzed by the Council of Europe and Russia's desperate efforts to get into that organization and the European Convention of Human Rights would spark legal reform. And it did. There has been tremendous legal reform. But there have always been levers in place to start the suppression. And I'd be happy to share in the Q&A what happens to you if you go out to one of these protests. But I'll end with a slightly funny story that at least law professors would appreciate. I have a friend at the University of Helsinki I was communicating with, and she said, she's Russian. She said, I just got back from a protest, I was arrested, and I was really worried, because what they do is, instead of arresting you for a criminal offense, you're arrested for an administrative offense, hooliganism. And if you get 3 of those, you really can get sent for a long time to prison. But this expedites and sort of avoids the messiness of criminal due process. So she said, I had my second strike, and I was so glad to get out. I said, how did you get out? Oh, she said, one of the policemen was a former student. So consider the police force if things start to go bad. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleagues and friends.
Fantastic, Jeff. Thank you. I think we can see why you're a multiple-time winner of Teacher of the Year awards, and we'll call you from the recruiting committee here pretty soon. I hadn't thought about how like my butt may be up to some of you to save one day, so. I think we do want to get to Q&A. As Jeff said, that's going to be the most interesting thing. But let's kind of do a run through of some of the legal frameworks. The theme I hear in all that you're saying is the critical essence that we take for granted so often here in the United States of actually having the rule of law, not rule by law, which is what authoritarians have, but rule of law. How critical it is and how it's so fragile, so fragile. That's the story of our times. And so let's pay serious attention to the legal framework. There's the UN Charter. We talk about the principle of the inviolability of borders for non-voluntary change. Where is that legally expressed? It's Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. It's straightforward that as a default matter, you cannot use force or the threat of force to interfere with territorial integrity or political independence. So, what is it that the Russians say? One possibility is they might say nothing and just show contempt for the law without even trying to put an argument out there. That's not what they've done. They have put forward an argument. Let's just kind of run the traps and see what we all think of it. In the UN Charter, Steve's voted early. In Jeopardy, you have to time it right. WT, we won Jeopardy. Did you see that? We won like the national championship. Okay.
It was one guy.
So,
in the form of a question. So I think Steve probably should have said, what is bullshit?
Some of your answers not timely. So, in the UN Charter system, you can use force under certain circumstances. If the Security Council will authorize the use of force under Chapter 7, that waives the sovereignty violation. Quick pop quiz: why is it that there was never snowball's chance in hell that there would be a Security Council resolution authorizing anybody to do anything vis-a-vis Ukraine?
Well, if France and the United Kingdom both had a heart attack, we would still be there.
Right. So we would veto anything that the Russians were to try to ask for. And now that the Russians have invaded, what happened when the Security Council had a resolution before it? The Russians vetoed it. By the way, they weren't alone in not supporting this. Does anyone know some of the countries that did not support condemnation? Who else?
North Korea.
You got North Korea?
Wait, don't forget Syria.
Well, but they also had India. And it's interesting. They're not alone. It's not just rogue nations that are choosing to look the other way. There are nations that feel economically dependent in various ways. And India, I don't think we're second, that the Modi administration is happy about this, but they have made a judgment that their national interest requires that they abstain. And it's a really sad thing. Now, the Russians can't get a Security Council resolution to authorize this. What they have done is they've claimed that they're acting in self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter, which says in the event of an armed attack, you can use force in self-defense, of course, and other states can come to your collective aid. So it raises the question, what in the world is the pretext here? And the pretext that they put forward is, if you read Putin's speech where he sort of lays out this sort of melange of World War II, Great War nostalgia, and characterizations of how he interprets the post-Soviet collapse experience of watching NATO expand some, watching some of the newly freed republics clamoring to be let in. And now you see why they clamored to be let in, claiming in effect that it was necessary to act now against the Ukrainians before the Ukrainians acted against Russia, which is, what was the phrase he used, the technical term?
You used it, bullshit.
Bullshit. But then there's also this more complex move. We talked about this in the podcast last week. Having in 2014 intervened with the Little Green Men to create a de facto autonomous pro-Russian puppet region in the East, choosing to purport to recognize as newly independent, he called them People's Republics, these two new Eastern regions, and saying, they are now members of the community of nation, and they, and this is more plausible, they have something to fear from Kyiv, trying to reclaim and reassert authority. So they have an anticipatory self-defense situation on their hands, and they can call on us for collective self-defense help. Here we come, guys, to protect you from all the wicked machinations in Kyiv. So what this highlights is a couple things. One, the arguments are baloney. However, so what? What then follows from any of this? We don't have mechanisms. When the Security Council can't act because of the veto, that is, for all practical purposes, that's it for the United Nations. Yes, the General Assembly is going to pass a censure. I'm glad they are, but it's a censure.
What if the General Assembly de-recognizes Russia as the successor state to the USSR?
Do you think there's any chance they would actually do it?
It's a majority vote.
But do you think there's any chance they'd actually do it?
Well, it happened to China.
It happened to China. Or it happened to, well, what we today call Taiwan, yes.
Yeah. So
Yes, it happened to China, and what do we call it now?
But yeah, by the same token, in theory, there could be a revamp. A lot of people are saying, like, wait a minute, maybe it's time for the Security Council to be blown out and replaced by something more equitable and less singularly vetoable. This could portend finally a change to the post-World War II UN Charter system at that level. What about, though, criminal law, international criminal law, and the International Criminal Court? Many people hear this and think, wait a minute, so you're saying there's a war crime of aggression, which is exactly what I'm saying. The
To say nothing of all the additional war crimes the Russian military is committing in Ukraine.
Indeed, as the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg famously said in its judgment against the Nazi leadership, convicting of the war crime of aggression and basically establishing the war crime of aggression, or more to the point, the crime against peace of aggression. Aggression, the unjustified initiation of war, is the supreme war crime, for in it lie all of the others that inevitably follow, even in the best circumstances. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the thrust of it. So the Russians are not party to the International Criminal Court statute, just the United States likewise.
Neither is Ukraine.
But Ukraine did do one interesting thing that's relevant here. After the Russian intervention in 2014, first temporarily and then in a way that still has effect, they didn't become party to the Rome Statute, but they accepted the jurisdiction of the prosecutor nonetheless for any war crimes occurring on its territory. And for whatever it's worth, the prosecution function at the ICC is open an investigation. This is a pretty open and shut case, in my opinion. But again, the question arises, so what? Like, it's good that this machinery is calling the situation what it is, but do we actually think that there's going to be an arrest on this basis? The only way this has any practical effect on the Russians is if something much more momentous happens, which is basically a coup from the leadership to take down Putin, which, by the way, if you're wondering, like, is there any end game where he's actually stopped here over time? I don't think so, unless enough of the oligarchs and the military leaders who he humiliated publicly in the days before the war in a bizarre, like, if you saw this in a movie, you'd think that's a little cartoonish how they're making Dr. Evil there be so patently evil. Unless something like that happens, probably it's all just talk. But that doesn't mean it's legal.
Can I say, I mean, so I agree about the sort of shortcomings of the enforcement mechanisms, right? I don't think Putin's getting on a plane to a country that accepts the ICC's jurisdiction. That'd be pretty dumb. I do think, though, that it's not right to say, as some have publicly, that therefore these international law violations are irrelevant.
Not irrelevant.
Right? And I think part of what they have done, and part of why it is so critically important that the United States and the United Kingdom and a handful of other countries sort of were out in front on the intelligence side of this, is it has helped to sort of sharpen for all to see the sort of lack of any plausible defense of what Putin's done, which I think has in turn facilitated the gravity and rapidity of the economic sanctions, right?
That's right, because they were going to stage an incident,
right,
try to muddy the record, make it seem like maybe it was.
Right. So imagine if 2 days before the Reichstag fire, right, the remaining independent newspaper in Berlin publishes details on how Hitler's going to stage the Reichstag fire. You don't get the Reichstag fire decree on the far side, right? And so I think it's a fascinating lesson in both what international law can do and what it can't do, both from the sort of difficult to enforce perspective, but easy to create political consensus when you have strong norms, and in this case, clear rules that are being violated.
And further evidence to support what you're saying is the dog that didn't bark. I think a lot of people were very worried in 2014 when Crimea was in that. I never mind that nobody recognized it. But over a period of time, what didn't happen? Well, sanctions didn't stay in place. Right. World outrage didn't continue. iPhones are still being sold in Russia. Well, they aren't now, but they were then. And the fear is that over time, the world forgets, we move on to the next crisis. And what I said at the beginning about how public international law is built and sustained is by consistent state practice. And maybe this leads into the next point that you're going to raise. One of Putin's arguments also, so easy to distinguish on the facts, is that a whataboutism? What about what the US has done? So,
Well, what I was gonna say real quick is that it actually really does matter that these superficial gestures to say like, well, this was the war crime of aggression. It may not matter because Putin can stay in Moscow and it won't directly affect him, but it matters for everyone else. It puts down a marker, and not everyone in the future who's going to commit aggression or would contemplate that action will be able to count on not being at risk themselves of personal jeopardy.
But also, I mean, Jeff's point is really important though, right? You didn't see real pressure on Western corporations to divest themselves of Russian involvement after Crimea, right? And we've seen it now. And I think without the strong international consensus that has emerged over the last month, I'm not sure that would have happened, right?
ironically, by taking a bigger second bite,
Yes,
he has triggered what should have happened in the first place.
yes.
Because after Crimea 2014, the concern was, does this send a message to China? Does
So-
this send a message to other irredented
Is it the SAR in Sudetenland, and this time Sudetenland was a bridge too far? Right, because that's the problem, right? It's that, I mean, in some respects, it's reliving all the worst things about Europe in the mid-30s. So I think the question is then, if that's not going to sort of get Putin out, right? What happens next, and what's the U.S. side of this?
Right, and this is where I think the sanctions, which currently we have a remarkable moment of rule of law countries, East and West, uniting with some defection for the countries that are more economically vulnerable, but we have a pretty good amount of economic pressure beyond what Putin, clearly beyond what he thought was going to happen, because he was learning from the last round, thinking that the West was sufficiently compromised, the Germans were too exposed on their energy dependency with Russia, that there were too many other countries that wouldn't step up, but they have. But will it last? I mean, do you think if this, let's assume the following fact pattern, there being no face-saving off-ramp, what Putin decides to do is simply to grind Ukraine to dust and kill everybody and do what it takes eventually to topple the regime and install a puppet regime. And so there will be even more sanctions as the bloodshed mounts. But 2 years from now, I think the gas is flowing in Nord Stream 2. I bet it is.
And here's another scenario. I think that it would be far too costly for Putin to try to impose his will in the long run over all of Ukraine.
Right.
So here's a face-saving way out for him that still accomplishes a lot of his goals. If the goal of Transnistria is not to create Transnistria for its own sake, but to just keep Moldova down, then the goal of this struggle is just make sure Ukraine is not, it's a zero-sum game. Ukraine is not part of the West. Ukraine is not part of the West militarily, or politically, or economically. So you grind these cities to the dust. Maybe you seize and call it Novorossiya, New Russia. You seize a strip of land from the Donbass down the coast of the Sea of Azov. He's already got Mariupol to Crimea. Maybe if you're bold, you go as far as Odessa, which he would tell you, and here's another grain of truth, is a classic imperially Russian city, he would say. And a lot of historians would talk about the Russian influence on Odessa. He just keeps that strip and says, all right, I'm out. I've demilitarized, I have defascistized, I've denazified Ukraine. And that's what I told you.
I've denazified Ukraine by getting rid of the Jewish president.
That's what I told you this special military operation was all about. And I've accomplished that mission. I'm going home.
So let me say, I do not share your view that Europe is going to roll over, right? Because I think if that were, not necessarily because they're going to do the right thing, but because they're in it now, right? And I don't know how, if you're Germany, for example, you now go back to Putin, right? If all Putin's done is what Jeff suggests, like I don't know how you say, oh, well, in that case, it's fine.
I think that it would be a long time coming, but I think eventually they'll wear out, because the record of the past many years is they just steadfastly refuse to stand up to the earlier stages of the aggression. And once the emotional moment has passed and the cameras turn to the next big thing.
But of course, this also assumes Putin continues to act rationally and doesn't, for example, cross over into Poland, right?
Yeah, I don't think he's gonna, do you think that he would attack any NATO country?
Well, no.
And if not, let's talk about why, right? Because not everyone knows the NATO treaty.
Yeah, if you attack one NATO country, you attack them all. And
Including us.
The mechanism, now, does that mean that he couldn't get away with covert action, with the sort of little green men activity and edging into the Baltics? Right, that's the game of chicken that's involved.
Well, also, I mean, the map, Jeff, I mean, there's a little piece of Russia called Kaliningrad that is not attached to Russia, and that has Poland and parts of Lithuania, right, between it and Russia.
It used to be Königsberg, which
Yes.
was the city that Kant was from, for a country.
Also
that used to be
historically
called
Russia.
Yes.
But, that goes to the point. Go find Ruthenia on the map. It's not there anymore. There are lots of shifting borders, and Kaliningrad is a classic example of just a sort of thing that just remained.
My older sister actually lived in Kaliningrad for 4 years, and I went to visit her, and it's remarkable.
I'll bet you didn't visit twice.
No. But it's remarkable because it is a Soviet city with German architecture, and very little else.
And maybe this brings us to cyber, because the fear that I have is, and as you say, muddying the waters, what happens if we accept as a premise that Putin's goal is not necessarily total territorial control of Ukraine? He's happy to play the long game, like he did with Georgia in 2008, take a piece here, take a piece there, pretty soon it adds up. And he just decides to destabilize. So we'll wreck the central bank of Estonia. We'll wreck the electrical grid of Lithuania. We'll unleash the waters of a dam in Latvia. It muddies the waters enough. Is that an attack? Is that an armed attack that would trigger Article 5?
So the emergence of the cyber domain has raised all these questions about whether and when something that's accomplished through digital means should count as triggering either the UN Charter rules on armed attack or the NATO alliance rules on armed attack, or for that matter, just the policy concept, which ultimately matters most of all for the victim state. Are they going to respond militarily because of how they choose to interpret what's happening to them? The legal version of that question has been addressed ad nauseum for like the past 15 years, and the center of gravity in that debate.
Which is why I asked the question.
So it's an effects test, basically. I mean, this isn't like binding on anyone, but the consensus of all the scholars is, look, you don't worry about how it was accomplished, ask what was accomplished.
But you also have to ask who accomplished it.
Indeed, but that's always been true. So for example, you could accomplish all the things you just described through human beings. It might be more difficult. It might be easier to pin it down if you catch someone in the act, but acting while in a covert, so we call this covert action. Acting in a way where you hope that it's not apparent and it won't be acknowledged that you did it, even if people are pretty sure you did it, but you should know it wasn't me. That could and has been done by human beings. Now, the real difference, the game changer with cyber is that it makes it possible for everybody to play that game. In theory, it collapses all the geographic constraints, and the more we connect critical infrastructure systems to the web, the more, or to digital means, the more vulnerable they all, in theory, become. The attack surface grows.
My fear is that if we respond, and either there is mistake or we respond too strongly, Fiona Hill thinks we're already in World War III. So if we don't respond, then we further weaken the alliance, and we might even precipitate another attack.
And so this is the phenomenon of escalation dominance. And we saw this happen in the cyber domain. The United States and Iran, if you want to figure out how to tell that story, it's a very hard question to decide where's the first incident. It's a long history of highly adversarial actions, sometimes overt, sometimes covert, going both ways. And at some point in around 2010, during the Obama administration, the Iranians conducted pretty disruptive cyber operations on a series of American banks, including JP Morgan Chase. They were really having a big impact. The Obama administration had to decide, should we counter within domain, in the cyber domain, and carry out a disruptive operation on their banks? And Treasury Secretary Geithner argued that this would be a disaster because he was convinced the Iranians would respond in kind to more American banks, our attack surface being more vulnerable in the cyber domain than theirs. His argument was, we can't afford to escalate this. They're more willing to cause damage than we are to them. Now, whether that was the right analysis or not, because it's an awfully myopic analysis only to think about the within cyber domain. Like, why not do something outside the cyber domain? But in any event, the administration decided, you're right, we got to let this go. Let's finish the process of fending off this attack. Let's not push further now, maybe later, but not now. In the current context, both sides are playing this theoretic game of chicken, trying to figure out, as we level up our economic sanctions, and they are wrecking the Russian economy. It's unbelievable the damage they're choosing to take. They're on a pathway to North Korea. he can counter with sanctions. They do counter with sanctions. When American airlines were told no more flying to Russia, he said, all right, well, no Russian airlines flying to America. Sorry if that messes up your spring break plans. that
Those
domain,
relations are great, man.
that domain's useless for them. So, but if we're causing economic harm to them and they can't counter within domain with sanctions, what's the natural thing to do? Well, where are they capable? They're capable in the cyber domain. So I'm sure there's an ongoing discussion there, like, should we do something harmful to the Americans and to others in the cyber domain? Well, if you do, in the current context, we're pretty likely to escalate back, but everyone knows this is all taking place in the shadow of nuclear war, and that is why the Russians keep publicly talking about nuclear war.
Right.
They're trying to remind you that you don't want to mess with us. We're crazy. This is going to get crazy. Don't escalate. We're going to get crazy.
So can I suggest we do 5 minutes on the U.S. domestic war power piece of this?
Yeah, no, let's
and
do
then
Q&A.
Q&A. So then the question is, how much can President Biden do by himself, right? And at what point does he need Congress? And here we come to what is pretty well tread, if not well established, legal territory. There's a difference between those two things, right? Which is, I think everyone agrees, right? That something that is clearly offensive military force almost certainly requires statutory authorization of some form, authorization that probably does not currently exist. You disagree?
If we mean above the threshold of war.
Yes.
Above the
Offensive force
threshold.
above the threshold of hostilities as defined in the relevant, yes. And that the NATO treaty by itself is not enough, even if it's an attack on a NATO member, right, that we would need something from Congress.
We would have an international obligation to act, but it
No
would be up
domestic
to,
authority.
it'd be up to Congress to make sure we.
Right. The two places that are messier are short of war, right? That is to say, uses of force that do not amount to hostilities, as Harold Coe, among others, might define them in testimony to the Senate, and right, self-defense. Context where we are protecting U.S. personnel, U.S. interests, U.S. institutions from attack, whether in the cyber realm or in the more tangible physical realm. And I think the critical point there is that there's a lot of authority for the president to act unilaterally in that space, and the lines are blurry between where that space ends and the congressional space kicks in.
That's right. And so maybe we talk about some of the things that have been talked about as policy options. No-fly zone. Some people keep talking about establishing a no-fly zone. I wish. That'd be great. I would love to close the skies to the Russians. I don't think the U.S. Air Force should go into air-to-air combat with the Russian Air Force. And I think that to take that step would require congressional approval if that was to be done without some other provocation, because that would clearly be international armed conflict with, our old Cold War rival. That's World War III, once you take that step. So
It's a good time for Top Gun Maverick to come out.
Exactly. Is there ever a good time for that? No.
This is why they were waiting.
So the more interesting question is, okay, well, what about a partial no-fly zone, like a protected zone in the far west, where you could, where you could do it without obviously butting up against Russian air power? That's possible. What about a humanitarian channel into Kyiv if it's besieged, when it's besieged? If you're going to really provide air cover that whole way, you're going to have dogfights with MiGs. I mean, we're probably not going to take that step. And the Biden administration's been pretty clear it's not going to take that step. What about if even if there's not a cyber provocation, what if we decide to use our cyber means to disrupt Russian military operations, just screwing with communication capabilities in a way that we're trying to keep it deniable? That's really interesting. I would argue that based on the executive branch of in the hands of both parties over the past several decades, the position on what counts as war for constitutional war powers purposes and what counts as hostilities for war powers resolution purposes is set really high and linked in with exposure to bloodshed on the part of American armed forces boots on the ground. And it's pretty easy to mount an argument, and they would mount an argument, that you don't have to worry about compliance with separation of powers and war powers if you're just engaging in cyber operations. The counter argument would be, yes, but escalation risk to World War III.
And you and I have had this conversation about 407. We've had 260 episodes of the podcast. I think we've had this conversation 417 times. The problem here that changes all of the calculus is that it's Russia.
Yeah.
Right? Because the escalation risk, the chance of all-out combat and all-out hostilities when we're conducting a drone strike in Iran, right, or in Iraq or in Syria, is light years shy of the escalation risk when we are putting combat troops on Ukrainian territory in the face of on Russian troops. So my one last question about that. So how about sending U.S. troops to the Polish border?
No problem.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then if they're attacked, no statute.
Self-defense.
Yep. I think that's right. And indeed, I think President Biden could justify the deployment of US troops to the Polish border as in furtherance of our treaty obligations under the NATO treaty.
I think it's an easy call. I'm sure you guys have lots of questions. Let's get you guys involved. I don't know where to start. You do the calling.
In the back.
So one of the questions, or one of the biggest things I've been seeing out of this is the difference between the leaders, President Zelensky and President Putin. And so, in looking back in 2020 when Putin ensured that he could be president forever, in making those amendments to the Constitution, what does that look like now, or what do you think it will look like in Russia when Putin passes on and leaves this, very messy legacy? Like, what is going to happen, especially when the people are seeing the Ukrainian people fall in love with this comedian, lawyer, turned president?
4 quick points. That's exactly why the color revolutions are so frightening in Russia. That's point 1. Point number 2, you're not watching the same war as anybody else in Russia who doesn't have a VPN connection. And so control of the mass media. I mentioned Echo Moskvy and Novaya Gazeta. I mean, I can count on the fingers of one hand the sources in Russia where you could get some robust pushback from the main team. As far as the typical Russian population is concerned, and I'm not talking about Petersburg or Moscow, I'm talking about the mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters of the soldiers that are, or should have been in Belarus and are now in Ukraine. They're being told that this is Western aggression. With regard to Putin changing the Constitution, he's a lawyer. We shouldn't forget that. Putin's a lawyer too, or at least he went to law school. So there's a danger.
Wait, so you're saying, so one of them might be the cop who lets us out of prison, and one of them might be Putin?
Right. So there's a danger always in those mechanisms that they could be used against you. He has destroyed every possible mechanism like that. 4th and final point, there is no greater time of danger in Russian history than when the Tsar is unsteady, is absent, when uncertainty reigns about who reigns. There are all sorts of Russian slogans and words for that, but they all boil down to a time of trouble.
They all rhyme with 1917.
Does anything rhyme with 1917?
In Russian?
Orange.
So with everything that has happened, obviously, it seems that Putin has had a very long game since the end of the Cold War, with releasing Ukrainian weapons, with the conflict in Georgia, then with Crimea, and now this. How much of that do you think is Putin's long-term strategy versus Putin reacting to the possibility of Georgia joining NATO or Ukraine joining NATO? And what more of it is the politics between America and Russia, and just Russia having this very grand plan?
I don't think that he is the grand puppet master who has pulled every string between 2000 when he became prime minister and then president and today. But he is very good at pushing people in events and then taking advantage. So he pushed Mikhail Saakashvili, the president of Georgia, in 2008, and Saakashvili kind of fought it and then paid for it with this invasion. So I don't think he's a grand master in that way. Another thing he's very bad at is perceiving the internal governmental structures and mechanisms of other countries. So he just simply doesn't believe that Western democracies might want to do something but are inhibited from doing it because of some legal constraint. Never affected him. And you see the world through your own prism. So he's notoriously bad at that, and that can lead to some miscalculations. And he's had a few of those too.
My greatest concern is that this war can turn nuclear. As we know, Vladimir Putin has put his nuclear forces on alert. And if we go in the next 4 to 6 weeks and Putin is unable to achieve his objectives, which is to overtake Ukraine, force Zelensky out, turn it into a vassal state, if he feels that there's no way out for him, that he can't save face, he has to have these objectives, and uses tactical nuclear weapons, whether it's artillery shells or whatever else, against the Ukrainian people to force them to break. Do you think it's possible? And if it does happen, what would the West's response be?
I'll say this about tactical nukes. So they've changed their doctrine to embrace that possibility, which is terrifying. And it's important the way he specifies. So tactical nukes in the theater, not used against others on the outside, make it harder to explain why you would actually go strategic nuclear against him. Probably wouldn't. There'd be vast condemnation in the pathway for Russia to become a full pariah state, entirely cut off, including through energy to the rest of the world. That would be pretty locked in. So it's really not in his interest to do it. But I also think we'll come to that. Tactical nukes are relevant primarily if you've got actual in the field overt holding of the ground you can't overcome. The Ukrainians over time can't stand up to Russian conventional military. The Russians just haven't yet brought to bear the full conventional power they've got, but they're trending that way. They've moved beyond their initial 15-day plan where they thought they were going to roll right in. They're shifting towards mass, the Chechen model. They'll just do that. They'll never need to use tactical nukes. They'll never want to take that risk because the Ukrainians won't be able to stand in the field in the same way, unless we were providing air cover, in which case we're probably on the way to World War III.
Do you think there's also a risk that in order to use tactical nukes actually causes a bit of a mutiny within the Russian military?
Could. I mean, it's certainly a step. We're wondering where will there be steps. I like to think that our many of the Western intelligence agencies are messaging relentlessly about to key oligarchs and military and intelligence figures saying, like, this guy's ruining your retirement plan rapidly. You need to take him out. He's crazy.
No more Chelsea.
No more nothing. No more $800 million super yachts.
Yeah.
You hear about that one?
It is. I like the Ukrainian who tried to sink the yacht. Did you see that one?
No.
There was a Ukrainian steward or mechanic who was arrested because he basically tried to sink his boss's yacht.
That's awesome. more of that, please.
Yeah, all of that.
I saw it played out somewhere that Russia invaded Crimea as soon as the 2014 Olympics ended, and they went into Ukraine as soon as these Olympics ended. Why do they care? Is it who's hosting? Is it image?
But Jeff, you can talk about the prestige element that Russia in particular places on international competition. Above all, I think the Olympics.
Yeah, and so, as I understand it, and this is all just from reading the newspaper, just like you, the agreement was not to tread on China's toes. And so this might also be about Chinese-Russian relations. And yes, I think that Russia has a tremendous emphasis on the prestige value of these Olympics. That's why they fought so hard for the Winter Olympics in Sochi. But the timing of this, I don't know. I think that
More about not giving China a black eye than about the Olympics specifically.
Putin and Xi had a meeting before the Olympics, and it's pretty clear. It's been claimed in the papers in the past 24 hours that they had a deal. Do not start this, but I don't think they were ever going to do it during the Olympics. The Winter Olympics are a big deal to the Russians, and they do not want to be shunned. And
they don't want to be stopped from cheating in them.
Well,
Look what they did to that poor kid.
and it just was announced today, I think, that the Russian and Belarusian teams have been excluded from the Paralympics.
Why don't we take 3 more questions directly, straight, and then we'll answer them in turn. So over there, Luke, and then I'll take you, and then over here. Yeah, you three. Go first.
I'm curious about how the Shanghai Agreement comes into play into this. China's been conspicuously silent. Russian urbanalism plays really well in Beijing. We're seeing Russian international military cooperation with Lukashenko and Kazakhstan for the first time, probably since the Cold War. Should we be seriously concerned about the rise of a new Warsaw Pact
that's a marriage of convenience. They have a lot of coincident interest in breaking the international rule of law order, and especially American support for it. I do think that China is looking at this and thinking they were going to see some useful improvement on the pathway towards taking Taiwan, and now they're looking at this thinking oh, this is actually probably turning out to delay the eventual Chinese push on Taiwan than probably what they expected.
Can I also say, the piece that we haven't talked about enough, and I don't think, I know I'm not enough an expert, we might not be either, is the sort of the attack on the dollar reserves, right? The interference with the central bank of Russia, right? Which had never happened before in modern international banking. I wonder if China also looks at that and says, oh.
They're more capable of standing on their own to a certain extent,
yes.
But
they also hold a ton of U.S. currency.
They have more leverage on us than the Russians.
Yes. Yeah.
I have a bad habit of rambling, so I'll keep this short and sweet. You mentioned the whataboutism issue. I'm imagining it has something to do with the invasion of Iraq. You could explain the kind of arguments that Putin may deploy, some legal arguments that he will deploy this whataboutism, because some people in America, including a former president and a popular TV show host, I sympathize with them. So I'm just wondering, what are the arguments he's gonna make and how we would vote?
I was wondering if he was gonna come up today.
In a 30-second response, there have been very controversial interpretations of when it's permissible to use force, and one of them is about a responsibility to protect. So in Kosovo, for instance, this is a scenario that Putin repeatedly brings up, that it was claimed that there's a responsibility to protect and prevent potential genocide, and so there is this permissibility in international law that could be read into it, just in the broadest strokes to describe it in that way. Very controversial, not accepted by all. Maybe public international law is in the making, but he says, well, you say you have a responsibility to protect, I have a responsibility to protect. What's the difference? The difference is that we didn't want Kosovo to be the first 51st state of the Union.
Can I say, I think there's another difference also, which is, I also think that there's an argument, although maybe not a completely convincing one, that R2P looks a lot different when you're going to protect a democratic state versus when you're not, right? And so, R2P, if it's protecting the democratic government of Ukraine, is one thing. R2P, if it's protecting the hastily erected, not very democratic government of the People's Republic of Luhansk, something else.
Right? But it's that seed on which lies are grown, that, and as Bobby's metaphor put it, the muddying of the water.
Which goes back again to why I think the intelligence preemption was such an important part of the story. Last question.
Yes, we talked about how Putin tends to escalate, and I'm thinking if he is repelled from his objectives in Ukraine, he will have an argument, which is already laying the groundwork for 10 years to start trying to place some strategic weapons in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, or kind of escalate those friendships with these kind of hostile regimes close to the United States, and kind of make the argument, you think sovereignty is so important, what we start, if countries in your backyard want to have these type of weapons, what would the United States, I just feel like it would be a little bit, the United States put in a weird position to try to say, you can't do it in Cuba, but we can do it in Ukraine.
Well, he's already said, I believe he said he's going to put nukes back into Kaliningrad, and that is something that is in the same nature, putting nukes right on the doorstep of the European powers. Yeah, could he do the same in Cuba or Venezuela? I suppose. The United States obviously would denounce it as destabilizing, et cetera, and would continue what it probably already is doing, which is using all the legitimate means of putting pressure on countries to try to get a different regime in those places anyways. I mean, we have been trying very hard to get Maduro out. We've been trying unsuccessfully for generations to get the Castros out. I think this would accentuate those kinds of efforts.
And if you're looking for one book to read, as exams are coming up.
Martin Wexler's The Federal Courts and the Federal System.
A great history of that Cuban Missile Crisis is Abram Chay's very, very short book, in which he makes the argument that it's not necessarily that international law could prevent or stop or dictate some result, but it can shape the avenues of thinking and the possible courses of action, and that there's a value right there.
And just the last thing I would say is, this isn't the Cuban Missile Crisis all over again, because that was squarely the US versus the USSR, right? There's the role for Europe here that is distinct from ours, right? That a lot of this conversation, right, is Putin's concern about losing influence to his West. And so, the Venezuela part, the Cuba part of that doesn't solve his Europe problem. But we could probably go on for another 7 hours.
You guys are awesome for turning out. Thank you so much.
And thanks.
What a class.